Merry Christmas, Metamorphs! Chris Lester here on a cold and rainy Christmas evening in Madison, Wisconsin. I am here with Jewel. Say hi, Jewel. And we are going to read you guys the last part of Wizard Family Solstice. If you haven't seen the first two parts of this, you should go and watch them. They are in my Facebook feed, and they are also on the Fans of Metamor City feed. So go and watch those first, and then you can come and get caught up with this, the last part of the story. Part 3. Do you see what I see? John and Esme got dressed for the outdoors and exited the shop through the service entrance, which deposited them in a narrow alley between two brownstone buildings. The alley ran about 10 meters deep, ending in a pair of lift doors attached to one of the city's massive towers. They headed the opposite direction, emerging onto a sidewalk in a second-level shopping district. Snow lined the curbs of the skyway and clung to the awnings of the shops. Yule decorations were everywhere, colorful strings of lights and evergreen wreaths, and bright red ribbons with bows. The air was crisp and cold, but not frigid, and shoppers walked the pavement in a continuous throng, peering into window displays and chatting amiably. Holiday carols played from the neighborhood PA system, the speakers mounted on the poles of the streetlights. High overhead, the undersides of the next layer of skyways twinkled with an array of ever-changing green, red, and yellow lights. Esme looked around at it all, her eyes wide. "Stars above," she murmured. John grinned. "Yeah, we do Yule in a big way around here. Do you like it?" Esme blew a breath of air between pursed lips. "It's gaudy, obnoxious, and overwhelming. But strangely, yes." She gave John a lopsided smile. "But I still want that whiskey." John stepped up to the curb and looked around, getting his bearings. He spotted a familiar street name, checked the numbers on the nearest shop, and nodded. "Okay, I think there's a pub about 5 blocks that way." Esme stuck out one elbow toward him, her hand at her hip. "Lead the way, Master Tunstall." John stared at her arm for a moment, confused, then abruptly recognized the gesture from an old movie he'd seen. Tentatively, he threaded his own arm through hers, then looked up at Esme's face. The redhead gave him a sharp nod of approval, and they started off. The walk turned out to be closer to 7 blocks than 5, but Esme didn't seem to mind. She took in the decorations and the crowds and the revelry like she was watching a stage performance. I accidentally hit the end button instead of the page down button. Oops. Okay, where is it? There we go. Did it again, darn it. Technical difficulties. This is why I don't do live. Alright. She took in the decorations and the crowds and the revelry like she was watching a stage performance or some great festival in an exotic land. Then again, maybe that's exactly what the Metamorians were to a country girl like Esme. The pub, when they came to it, was a dimly lit hole in the wall, and the flag of ancient Southmore flying above the door was the only clue as to the nature of the establishment. They entered through a door of dark, heavy wood with brass accents, into a room composed mostly of the same. A banner hung over the bar, and with the words 100,000 welcomes in an ornate golden font. There were no carols here, no strings of lights or garland on every available surface. The patrons, mostly men, sat in 2s and 3s at small round tables, or lined the stools at the bar. Conversations filled the room, echoing off the countless hard surfaces until none of them were intelligible. A small Yule tree by the window was the single concession to holiday decorations. Esme let out a contented sigh. Now this feels like home. They sat at the bar, where Esme ordered for both of them without looking at the menu. The bartender, John noticed, was much more responsive than those he usually dealt with, which probably had a lot to do with the remarkable woman placing the order. She handed over her debit card, and 2 glasses of straight whiskey were promptly set before them. Esme tapped the bar with her fingertip, and the bartender left the bottle close at hand. She raised her glass. John copied the motion, and they clinked their glasses together. Sláinte, she said, and drained her glass. John, by contrast, only managed to get about half of his down before the burning liquor triggered a coughing fit. Not much for whiskey, are you? Esme observed, refilling her glass. It's a bit intense, John admitted. Like you, he thought, but he kept it to himself. Esme sipped at her second drink, visibly savoring the taste. Aye, she said, a bit more of her accent creeping into her voice. The perfect drink, whether you're celebrating or commiserating. She raised the glass in front of her face, and her eyes glistened in the dim light. So, here's to the daughter I'll never have. She threw back the rest of the drink, closed her eyes, and smacked the empty glass back down on the bar. Can I ask you something? John asked. Esme waved a hand permissively. Have you thought about adopting? There's a lot of kids out there who could use a good home. John had, in fact, met many such boys and girls in his encounters with the juvenile correctional system before Artax had taken him on as his apprentice. Esme nodded slowly. I've thought about it, and it might come to that now. But... She looked down at the empty glass. Her hand twitched toward the bottle again, then stopped. It's the magic, she said, more quietly. A child of my own body, by my own blood, would have the gift. She'd get it from me like I got it from Leia. She'd be strong, and I could teach her to use that strength. I could pass on what was given to me. Lots of kids who end up in the foster system have majory, John pointed out. Sometimes the parents don't know what to do with a kid who can do magic. Sometimes they hate him for it. He looked down at his own glass and took another swig of whiskey. Is that what happened to you? Esme asked gently. Your parents turned you out because you were a mage. John sighed. Not exactly. They knew I couldn't help being born a mage. They just didn't want me to actually do magic. Wouldn't let me join a guild. They said magic was too dangerous, and it caused nothing but trouble. They thought I could just leave it alone, not use it, pretend to be normal. But I couldn't stand not being what I was. He took another drink, shrugged. So I ran away. Got my collar removed on the street. Started learning magic from whoever would teach me. Esme put a comforting hand on his arm. And that's when you met Artax. John snorted. Well, first I got arrested. Spent some time in juvie. But yeah, he was like my parole officer. I hadn't committed any other major crimes. Not that they knew about, anyway. So I was eligible for a program to earn my novitiate's license. After I completed the basic program, Artax took me on as his apprentice. He allowed himself a small smile. Best thing that ever happened to me. I can believe it, Esme said. Did you ever reconnect with your family? John shook his head. No. They were pretty clear how they felt about my choices. Hells, now I'm a fugitive. I can hear Dad now. What did I tell you? Magic, nothing but trouble. He pitched his voice in a deep, pompous bellow, then slammed his palm on the bar for emphasis. Esme laughed at the impersonation, but her expression quickly grew serious again. She leaned in and covered John's hand with her own. "Can I give you a bit of advice?" John's skin tingled where she touched him. He turned his hand over and squeezed hers. "Sure." "Don't let the silence grow for too long between you and your kin," Esme said. "It's like a hedge. At first it's just a little thing, not much of a barrier at all. You could step right over it if you wanted to. But it gets higher and thicker the longer you leave it alone. Soon it starts growing thorns, so you can't even touch it without it hurting you, much less break through it to the other side. Next thing you know, it's too high to see over, and then you're all but dead to each other." She averted her eyes, then grabbed the bottle and poured herself another drink. John's own emotions were a tangled knot inside him. He did miss his family, sometimes, as much as he tried not to. He especially missed his kid sister, Clara. "She'll be in high school soon," he thought. "I wonder if she even remembers me." He raised his own glass toward Esme. "Well, here's to screwed up relationships with our parents. Let's hope we don't make the same mistakes." "Amen to that," Esme said, clinking her glass against his. They drank. John was starting to get a little lightheaded. "We should probably order some food, or Artax is going to have to come drag us out of here." Esme snorted. "You Metamorians. No stamina at all." "It's not what my last girlfriend said," said John, and then covered his mouth with his hand. "Oh, gods, John, you idiot, tell me you did not just say that." But Esme let out a peal of delighted laughter. She leaned back in her stool, swaying slightly, and put her hand over her heart, chortling. Then she leaned forward again and slapped his back hard. "Oh, well played, Master Tunstall. We'll make a sophomore of you yet." Then she slid her hand behind his head and kissed him. If John had felt tipsy before, the kiss made him feel utterly intoxicated. Their auras crackled and tingled as they wrapped invisibly around each other. Their Amalan traded mana between their reserves, which John felt as a surge of warmth rushing in and out of his core. He opened his aura sight, taking in the dazzling web of emerald green energy that surrounded him, flowed into him, merged and mingled with the deep red energies of his own aura. "Our own little holiday light show," he thought. But another thought followed fast after that one. "There's something weirdly familiar here." He broke the kiss and sat back, looking up and down at the shimmering lights of Esme's aura. He squinted and stared. Esme looked at him curiously. "John, what is it?" "Something. I saw it earlier in the scope, but I didn't know why it looked strange to me. Artax didn't think it was anything." He held out his hand. "Here, cover me with your aura again." Esme smirked. "So forward," she said. But she took his hand and extended her aura until it covered his arm up to the elbow. John closed his eyes, directed his attention away from the light show and toward the feel of the magical fields around him. There was something in her aura that he'd encountered before, something both strange and familiar. He concentrated on that peculiar arcane signature, holding it in his mind like a mantra, emptying his thoughts of anything else. He traced the pattern in his mind's eye, over and over, and let himself drift. And there, in the recesses of his memory, a pair of penetrating green eyes looked back at him. But they weren't Esme's. He opened his eyes with a gasp. Esme was watching him with an expression of confusion and concern. We have to talk to Artax, John said. I think I just figured out where you came from. The light was still on in Artax's study when they got back to the shop. John knocked firmly on the door. Master, we need you.
Go away,
Artax shouted.
I'm working.
Please, sir, John said. I think I'm onto something with Esme, but I need your help.
I am helping,
Artax said, his voice softer but still sounding annoyed.
If you'd leave me till morning, I'd be happy to assist you then.
You should listen to Master Tunstall, Mum, Esme said. You know the reason you're upset is because you're out of ideas. It won't hurt anything to try one more. There was a moment's silence. John imagined Artax sighing in exasperation.
Fine, come in.
There was a soft click, and the door swung open. Artax sat at his desk under a reading lamp, with a pile of books, scrolls, and parchments laid out all around him. He set down a large magnifying glass and looked up at them, his normally sharp blue eyes looking watery and tired.
What is it, Master Tunstall? He asked.
John took a deep breath. I want to try something with this thaumascope, he said. It should only take a few minutes.
Master Tunstall, we've already gone over Esme's aura in excruciating detail.
I know, sir, John said. But you know what you said about having blind spots where Esme is concerned? I think that might be literally true. Artax cocked his head and looked at John quizzically. After a moment, he started getting to his feet.
All right, boy, you have engaged my curiosity.
Lead on. They went back down to the lab and powered up the thaumascope. John turned to Artax and gestured at the stool. Have a seat, sir. Artax's eyes flickered to Esme for a moment. She nodded, and he sighed and sat down. John adjusted the scopes as Artax had taught him, focusing them on the amala behind the old man's forehead, the one associated with perception, and especially with a wizard's aura sight. Artax's aura was blue-white, brilliant and intense, and it took John a minute for his eyes to adjust to the glare. Once his vision had acclimated, he zoomed in and scanned over the swirling, interwoven lines of mana. It only took him a couple of minutes to find what he was looking for. A tangled snarl of lines, like a series of small knots, which made an intricately shaped hole in Artax's aura. As he zoomed in even further, John saw that each of these knots was bound with what looked like slender green threads, impossibly fine, like spider silk, and just as strong. There, John said. He beckoned to Esme and stepped aside for her to use the scope. Look at that. Do you see that? Esme put her eye to the scope, adjusted the fine focus knob slightly, and then gasped. By the stars, she breathed. That's a curse, and a damned subtle one, too. Artax's eyes snapped wide.
Someone cursed me? How in all the hells?
He stopped short, his mouth hanging open. A look of horrified realization spread across his face. There is something in Esme's aura, John said. Something that would give you the answer if you could see it. But somebody put a curse on you so you wouldn't be able to see it. They literally gave you a blind spot about your daughter. Esme's eyes narrowed. She looked at Artax. Who would have wanted to hide the truth about me from you? John crossed his arms. There's only one answer that makes sense, sir. Are you going to tell her, or should I? Artax's eyes flashed with a mixture of emotions. Anger, betrayal, pain, guilt. He clenched his fists.
Why would he do this?
He said, his voice low and hoarse.
Why?
He? Esme asked.
He who? Was it my father? No, he...
But then Artax's face turned white as another realization hit him. It was, John knew, the same thing he had realized as soon as he understood why Esme's aura felt so familiar. Artax slumped on the stool, his eyes staring at nothing. "Oh," he whispered. "I think we'd better give him a call," John said. "I'd say he owes you both an explanation." John got the honor of making the call, both because he had the number in his mobile phone and because Artax didn't trust himself to speak. It was answered immediately, and John was not at all surprised to discover that his interlocutor was already in town. He arrived at the shop's back door within 10 minutes. John opened the door to a handsome man of indeterminate age and medium height, with pale skin and short brown hair that faded to blonde near the tips. He had a neatly trimmed goatee and bright emerald green eyes, and he wore a double-breasted green woolen greatcoat against the winter chill. He smiled broadly at John. "Good Yule, Master Tunstall," he said. His voice was bright, clear, and strong, like a stage actor's. "Good Yule, my lord," John said, bowing his head in deference. "Please come in." The man stepped inside and removed his coat, revealing an immaculate green business suit underneath. "It is a pleasure to see you again," he said to John. "How are you getting on with Artax? Everything going well, I hope?" "It's been mutually beneficial, sir, just like you said." John raised his eyebrows. "Though I don't think either of us were expecting this." The visitor laughed merrily. "No, I expect not." He handed his coat to John, who took it and folded it carefully over his arm. "Well, let's get started, shall we?" Artax and Esme were waiting for them in the sitting room upstairs, with a fresh pot of herbal tea. Artax stood as the visitor entered and bowed his head. Esme gazed at the man with obvious skepticism. "This is him?" Esme asked, dubiously. "I thought he'd be taller." Artax cleared his throat. "My lord, may I present my daughter, Esmeralda Rose Freeburn?" He paused, then continued. "Esme, this is Lord Klepnos, the trickster, who is, apparently, your father." At this he gave his visitor a glare that might have seemed deeply inappropriate to direct at a deity, even a fallen one. John, however, knew enough of Artax's history with the god of fools to understand that look completely. Klepnos chuckled and clasped his hands over his heart. "Oh, I have been looking forward to this for a long time. May I?" He gestured at one of the armchairs. "Please," Artax said, dryly. Klepnos sprawled in his seat, hooking one leg over an arm of the chair. "Now then, I'm sure you have many questions. Since you were so clever as to solve my riddle, I'll even answer them." Artax and Esme sat back down as well. "I'll go first," Esme said. "Why didn't Mum know you were my father? How was I conceived?" Klepnos smiled indulgently. "Liam became Leia at my instruction. The reasons for it were many, and went deeply into psychological matters that are, frankly, only of interest to him. But part of Leia's journey necessitated becoming a mother, so I put her in touch with a fertility clinic in Sathmore." "Where they fertilized me with your sperm," Artax said, glaring at him again. "Yes," Klepnos agreed, blithely. "Why didn't you tell me?" Artax said. "Did you think I would refuse you, after all you did for me?" "On the contrary," Klepnos said. "If you had known you were carrying my child, you would have been overwhelmed by the responsibility. Raising any child is burden enough. Raising the child of a god is more than should be expected of anyone." Hearing herself described in those terms seemed to be more than Esme knew how to deal with. John saw her take a slow, steadying breath, in and then out again.
So, you put a curse on Leia, Esme said. You blinded her, so she couldn't see your marks on my aura.
Indeed, Clapnos said. And as for you, my dear daughter, I fitted you with a bit of supernatural birth control. Take it from me, it is unwise to go about conceiving little god-spawn unless you are quite aware of what you are doing.
Esme raised her chin obstinately. And what gives you the right to make that choice for me? To decide what I can do with my body?
Clapnos looked genuinely perplexed.
Esmeralda, I'm a god.
Artax tossed his head in a conceding gesture. Esme, though, crossed her arms.
That's as may be, she said, but you're not my god.
Jewel, get off off the computer, Jewel. Cats. Now I have to find out where I was before she started moving my cursor. Okay.
That's as may be, she said, but you're not my god.
No, but I'd like very much to be your father, Clapnos said, his voice suddenly devoid of levity. He put both feet on the floor and leaned forward, fixing her with those penetrating green eyes that were so much like her own.
Esme, all your life you have lived in ignorance of what you are. Up to now, this has all been to the good. Believing you were mortal, you learned a mortal's ingenuity and resilience. You were deeply loved, but you were never coddled, and because of this, you have grown up strong.
He extended a hand to her, palm open.
You learned much from your mother, and even more on your own. You are ready now for the lessons I would teach you. To harness your divine power, to control it, instead of it controlling you.
Esme looked from Clapnos to Artax.
What do you think, Mum? He lied to you. He used you.
Artax looked up, and John thought he saw the weight of the old man's years weighing on him more heavily than usual.
Aye, he said, but he also saved me. My life has been his since long before you came along, and he's never done anything to me that wasn't for my good.
He reached over and took Esme's hand, gripping it lightly.
I know I've not been the best parent you could have asked for. I had to put my own interests and yours behind my lord's commands. But you're the light of my life, child, and you never would have existed if not for him.
He smiled faintly.
He is an old scoundrel of a god, make no mistake, but he's earned my faith, and he'll earn yours if you let him.
Clapnos bowed his head very slightly and gave Artax a two-fingered salute.
You did well with her, Liam, as well as anyone could have asked. I'm proud of her, and you should be too.
Artax nodded slowly, still looking at Esme.
I am. You haven't walked the path I might have chosen for you, lass, but I'm still proud of all you've become.
Something in Esme's face and body language softened then. She closed her eyes and took another deep breath in and out. John imagined what it would feel like to hear those words from his own parents.
It would be the best damned Yule present in the world.
At last Esme opened her eyes again, turning her attention back to Clapnos.
So if I let you be part of my life, if I let you teach me, you'll undo the curse on both of us?
Of course, Clapnos said.
What will it look like? Esme asked. What am I committing to here?
Clapnos seemed to consider the question. For the first year, let us say 3 nights a week, for an hour each night,
and day-long sessions once a month. We'll spend that time working on the basics, what your power can do, how to access it, how to use it responsibly. I recommend you wait until these preliminaries are finished before you try to conceive. You'll need the time during the week to practice with your abilities, and as your own mother can tell you, your time is no longer your own once you have a child. Esme considered a moment longer, then nodded. All right, I accept. Klepnos rose to his feet and stepped around the coffee table until he stood beside Esme. He placed one hand on her forehead, then leaned over and did the same to Artax with his other hand. John felt a brief, subtle flicker of magic pass between them. He wouldn't have even noticed it if he hadn't specifically been looking for it. And then the trickster withdrew his hands and spread them, like a magician finishing a trick. "And done," he said. "Come on, then. How's about a big old family reunion hug? It is the Yuletide, after all." Esme and Artax exchanged a skeptical look. "You know what they say," Artax sighed. "You didn't choose your kin." "Aye," Esme agreed, wearily. Then they rose, and the trickster wrapped his arms tightly around them both. To their shared relief, Lord Klepnos did not invite himself to stay the night. After sharing a cup of tea with them, during which they spoke only of trivialities, the trickster bade them all good night. Artax was having some trouble with his knees, so Esme and John showed Klepnos to the door. The fallen god gave John a firm handshake and Esme a peck on the cheek. Then he saluted them both and strode off into the night, whistling a Yuletide carol. A light snow had begun to fall, and the snowflakes swirled and danced around him as he passed. "He's an odd duck, isn't he?" Esme observed, once he had gone. "Yep," John agreed. "Always wondered what sort of a man my father was," Esme mused. "Wonder if this is how Yahshua felt when he found out." John snorted. "I'm guessing that was a little different." "Aye, like as not," Esme admitted. "But just the same, there's a weight to it. Who am I, now that I know I'm his child? How does that change me?" She shook her head. "A gift like that, being the trickster's daughter, could be that's more a curse than a blessing." They fell silent for a time, watching the falling snow. In the distance, John could hear a song playing for the PA speakers. "For lo, the days are hastening on, by prophet bards foretold, when with the ever-circling years comes round the age of gold." The song brought back to mind the warning Klepnos had given Artax at their last meeting. "There's a time, just a few years from now, when all prophecy fails. All of it, Artax. The gods look, and we see nothing." The world was reaching a tipping point. What that would look like when it came, John had no idea. But he knew Klepnos was trying his damnedest to make sure things tipped the right way. Artax's mission was part of that. So was John's. And so, too, he suspected, was Esme's. "I think you're looking at this the wrong way," he said. Esme turned her head to look at him. She said nothing, but her eyebrows quirked up in question. "Look, it's like the magic, right?" John said. "We were born mages. It wasn't something we chose. It wasn't even something our parents chose. My parents saw I was a mage, and all they could see were the problems it could cause, the trouble it would bring. But your mother saw it as a gift, and she taught you to use it, to value it, to respect it, because it's who you are.
Esme's expression grew pensive. "That's true," she conceded. "I've never been afraid of my magic. Maybe being a god's daughter isn't so different." John grinned up at her. "You know what? Even before we knew who your dad was, Artax told me yesterday to watch out for you. He said you were a trickster." Esme made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an indignant snort. "Oh, did he now?" She turned and slipped her hands around John's waist. "And what sort of trickery did he tell you to be wary of?" "Oh, he wasn't specific." John reached up and placed a hand on Esme's cheek. She leaned into the touch, and slowly John slid his hand behind her head. "I guess he figured that a brilliant, gorgeous, experienced woman like you could take advantage of me in all sorts of ways." Esme stepped forward, pushing up against him, then pushing his back against the open door frame. Her hands held him tight, and she lowered her face until it was bare centimeters from his. Her breath came hot against his face, and those brilliant green eyes seemed to flash with a dangerous light. "You don't seem too worried about being taken advantage of, Master Tunstall." For a long moment John just stared into those eyes, hardly able even to think. Then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and showed her his brashest, most carefree smile. "I'm not afraid of tricksters. I've gotten close to 2 of them already, and it seems to work out for me pretty well." Then he leaned forward and kissed her. She responded instantly, pinning him to the doorframe as she answered his passion with her own, a growl of desire sounding deep in her throat. Their tongues danced, and he ran his fingers through that long, glorious red hair, and all sense of time and space drifted away. When at last they came up for air, Esme drew back and looked him squarely in the eye. "Is it true what you said earlier?" she said, breathing hard. "What your girlfriend said about your stamina?" John grinned. "Try me." "Oh," she said, "I intend to." She shut the door and led him upstairs. The shop called Holiday Treasures did not open again until 4 days after the winter solstice, but for John Tunstall and Esme Fairbairn it was a bright and merry Yule indeed. The end. So this concludes a Wizard Family Solstice. I hope that you guys enjoyed the story. I hope that you had a wonderful Christmas, that you have a happy New Year. I will be back with more episodes of The Raven and the Writing Desk in early January. Right now I am aiming for January 8th. If that changes, I will let you know. I've got to work on finishing up the last episode of the last few chapters of The Lost and the Least, and get that out to my beta readers. But once I do that, then I'll be back. And until then, enjoy this story. Let me know what you think in the comments, and keep it on the bright side. And Merry Christmas.